Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire. And this week on the podcast, I have a very special guest, somebody I've been trying to pin down for a while, Dan Hallagan from Kayenta Games. How you doing today, Dan?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am very happy to have you on. You are the designer of a game I very much like. You could say I'm even a little obsessed with it. Obsession. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that game?
Sure. I mean, I played games going way back when into the 70s to date myself a little bit. I played military games and Dungeons and Dragons and a lot of games that extended over a long period of time. You know, you would set something up on a table and pray that your mother didn't take it down and destroy like 3 weeks of labor. And so I was into games and then moved on with my career, got married, kids. I had a friend who in 2012, 2013 was trying to explain the concept of a modern tabletop board game. And I just sort of waved him away. One, because he was a big D&D player still in his 40s. He wanted me to play. I just didn't have time for that. I had a pretty active career in the medical business, and he kept at me, and finally, just to sort of shut him up, I said, you know, Christmas is coming up. What do you want me to put under the tree? Give me a couple titles. And in 2013, he gave me Seven Wonders and Dominion. And little did I have an understanding of what I was putting under the tree, because I said, okay, I get those. I put them under the tree. Well, we were my family, so I have my wife and 3 kids. At the time, they were teenagers, young teenagers. We wore those things out over that holiday vacation. And, you know, as is typical with our hobby, I then went out and overbought as many games as I could get my hands on, because I couldn't believe that what I had enjoyed as a younger person was being distilled down into a creative 2-hour experience on the table. Made it very practicable and accessible. And more importantly, what struck me was that my kids, and so as young teenagers with electronics, I was a typical dad. Put down your phone. Don't bring the phone to the table. You know, read a book. do something else that's not electronic. Well, they would toss their phones down and fight for a spot at the table, and that sort of put the light in my mind that there was something more important here, which was there was a way to sort of restore really the best part of being a family, everybody gathered around a table, laughing and using their imagination, their creativity, their brain power, because, you know, these board games can be thinky. And I was just sold that this was sort of an antidote to sort of where our culture was going. With people babysitting their minds and not, you know, reading books or using their imagination or just interacting around a table. So I was hooked from that point, and I'm surrounded by board games right now, like a lot of people probably listening, because I think they're special.
So what pushed you to design your own board game? How did you go from player to designer?
I always had that inclination. So back in those Dungeons and Dragon days, I was always the dungeon master. I always would design the universe that my friends would travel in. So I had that inclination, but what truly motivated me is I started to accumulate games. There were, you know, my wife in particular started getting pushed away because the dominant theme in our hobby is, if you think about it, is mythology, fantasy, space, and farming.
I'm in farm, yeah.
The farm, you know, the sheep, the wheat, that stuff appealed to my wife, and I wanted to make sure to keep it a family affair. But there's only so much sheep and wheat and wood, and Uwe Rosenberg, man, he's a great designer. I'm not knocking him, but there's only so much you can do with that before it gets a certain sameness. And I remember I had gotten Terra Mystica, and I tried to get my wife to come to the table and just look at it. I wasn't even saying, hey, play a game. And I mean, just the notion of a swarmling or a giant. Totally turned her off. She didn't want anything to do with it. And she said, come on, let's finish wherever we were in watching the series Downton Abbey. She said, let's watch some Downton Abbey. And so that's when the light bulb went off. And I said to myself, well, heck, I'll go find a game that's British 19th century literature type game. And I really couldn't find a game to satisfy me. I found some games, but it seemed that every time, whether it was Regency Romantic or Victorian or Edwardian, anything in that 125-year stretch, it was always treated lightly, almost like a party game. And I was very anti-party game. I liked crunchy games. And so I said, well, no one's really done a crunchy, I'll call it Victorian, but I would ask people to appreciate that I'm sort of referring to that full century plus of what I would call the aristocratic age from pre-industrial revolution through the industrial revolution to the decline of the aristocratic lifestyle in Edwardian times and beyond. And that whole period, because Heavy Cardboard did a podcast, and there was a guest who was a Scottish gentleman named Tony, and he was upset that people were conflating Jane Austen and Downton Abbey. He says, that's 100 years. You can't do that. But I think you can. I'm not saying from a like your perspective, a true historian's perspective, but from the flavor.
Yeah, I will confess. I will absolutely confess that I have both made Pride and Prejudice jokes while playing this game and pretended to be Dame Maggie Smith while playing this game. There's something about it that really does kind of lead to that.
Exactly. And it's interesting too, because there's I don't know how deep we can get, but there's a historical theme of the decline and fall of Pax Britannica, of that Victorian age, and of the domestic lifestyle, and how, I think I've had some people who have criticized me making a game about this period because it was a colonial power. There were very strict gender roles. There were, a lot of things that people want to criticize me for making. But first of all, I don't believe in rewriting history. And secondly, I think they lose sight of where our affections lie in these stories and in the literature. You're with Lizzie Bennet and Mary Thorne and David Copperfield and John Bates. You're with the underdog who's fighting against what would be perhaps the injustices of that historical period. And that's it's a backdrop. What I like so much about it, quite honestly, is one word: propriety. The propriety of that era, to me, creates a tremendous backdrop for stories. Whether you're dealing with a crazy wife in the attic, or whether you're dealing with a dishonorable military man in Wickham, you're dealing with people. There's no propriety in Breaking Bad world, right? Everything goes. You're only going to get death and destruction, but you can have something as what seems to the modern person as trivial as Lydia Bennet running away with George Wickham as being destructive to 1 to 2 families, and how that all plays out as really deep drama. That's what attracts me to it. I know that's what attracts my wife, my daughter, my sister-in-law, and my brother-in-law. There's that era of literature is so rich because of that sense of propriety.
So basically, those social rules, even if we think that they are stupid in our modern time, create tension and drama because people both chafe against them just like anybody would and feel a lot of pressure to follow them. Is that about where you're at?
Correct. Correct. And I think some of the social rules were very silly. And I think, some of the sense of honor. Now, remember, honor it can only be contemporary to its time. But judging somebody's sense of honor, like if you want to look at, Pride and Prejudice is about the prejudice of Darcy against his heart and the family of the Bennets, and the pride of Lizzie, who knows that she is a brilliant, worthy person, and that goes against the mores of the time. But his sense of honor and how he pivots 180 degrees to embrace a new role of judging people on the content of their character, that's ageless. So one of the reasons I sort of balk at the rewriting of history is because those historical actors, they didn't have any choice. Now, how they're measured and how they conducted themselves as far as what we know to be right and wrong in that historical period, that's fascinating to me. That's where you see a Darcy change. That's where, this isn't even in that period, but like when I think of Schindler's List, you saw Oscar Schindler at the beginning being a mercenary trying to basically extort military profits, and at the end, giving everything he had to save people. Those types of changes and that sense of honor, that's what appeals to me in those settings. And forgive my cat meowing if she's getting recorded. That is Duchess Lilo at my feet right now, wanting food.
I'm always in favor of cats. They are welcome at all times. So you mentioned that you chose this theme in part for your wife, but it sounds like you yourself have spent a lot of time reading Victorian literature. So when did that start in your life, and what are some of your favorites?
I will tell you that Victorian and really Regency, and I know Regency really refers to just the period after King George was incompetent and there was a regent, and that's a narrow time as opposed to the Romantic periods. That's probably more accurate. Those dramas got me to the books. I'm always read an enormous amount in my life. I used to, as a young nerd, keep a log, and I'd read 100 books in a year. But I tended to what our hobby tends to, which would be fantasy and science fiction and that things, and some military history. But more as an adult, the dramas got me to read the books.
So you mean like the BBC?
It's not a neat. Yeah, Masterpiece Theater is a mainstay in our house, and anything, whether it's Poldark or Victoria or Dr. Thorne, whatever it was, when that stuff comes out, we consume it, and that brought me to the literature sort of in the reverse order, because I would say that I wasn't probably mature enough as a teenager and somebody in their 20s to be happily strolling with Pride and Prejudice as the book and reading that, and that's not an easy read. That's one where you have to pick up the ear, if you will. I remember when my wife and I used to go to the Shakespeare Theater, it would be Act 2 before my ear kicked in and I could actually understand what they were saying without having that sort of delay in my brain. And the same sort of thing when I was reading Jane Austen. But I had a hunger to go, whether it would be Trollope or whether it be Austen or Dickens or, and read that, and the Brontes, and read that material. And I've always found literature, reading, to surpass drama on the screen, with very few exceptions. And so that's why I'm very much drawn in that direction. So if I see some great piece that's written on something, boom, go get the book and read that. And so it's a little bit of a inversion over my history of reading heavily as a kid. I do read the literature, but I've only read it over the last 10 or 15 years. And favorites would be Jane Austen, without a doubt. She's brilliant. I very much like Trollope. I mean, Dr. Thorne is a great. If you haven't read that one, I think that's great. Dickens, I like.
So I actually think this is really funny because the reason I enjoy all this literature is because I was once a middle school girl who watched the BBC Pride and Prejudice series and saw Colin Firth, who at that point was like Mr. Sexy. Let's be real. So I started I started reading all that stuff when I was a lot younger because, that was like the romance that I enjoyed reading. And I actually also have spent a lot of time in my adult life reading kind of Regency romances. I love romance novels. And so, a lot of this actually comes together for me from that direction. Have you ventured into the world of Regency romance?
Not outside of Jane Austen.
Well, I highly recommend if you want to add a little spice to your reading diet. So what kind of decisions went into bringing that literature, which you find so immersive, to life in the form of a board game where you're actually participating instead of just absorbing?
So when I investigated that genre and really found it wanting in board games, I conceived of a Trojan horse, and the Trojan horse was to turn this idea of a party game being necessary to recruit new gamers. Because I think there's always a little bit of evangelism in board gamers. They see the magic of board games and they want other people to come play. And so my idea, though, was not to get them to come play something like Just One or Werewords or something that's a party game, but something to get them to that next level of a crunchier game where they start to get a little deeper into a theme and they start get a little more complex and burning the brain power to figure out the game. And so I thought, I know so many people who are drawn to just to throw out some dramas, Downton Abbey, Pride and Prejudice, Upstairs, Downstairs. Bridgerton wasn't around then, but when I was designing. But to the point is, there's a lot of people drawn to those period dramas. And if they see it on a box, they would come to the box and then find inside the Trojan horse some complexity that was not part of any of the other treatments of this topic that I could find. And so that was my concept. It was a little bait and switch. Bait them with the period drama and switch it over into a bit of a crunchy Euro. And that really is sort of a oxymoron to have a crunchy gateway game. But that was sort of my play. And so to me, everything had to be the theme. It couldn't be pasted on. That's not going to get somebody hooked, if you will. It had to be enough to make it immersive. Everything about the game had to be tied back to the theme. And so that was my objective. I did a lot of homework. I went back to school a little bit. I studied, manor houses of the period, what kind of rooms they had. I documented all the rooms, the kind of servants. I read up on the servants' life. I got Isabella Beeston, who was written about what they eat. And so I was doing a lot of homework to try to immerse myself in the theme. And then as I developed the game, everything had to have a thematic explanation. And if it didn't have a thematic explanation, if it was just mechanically put in there to make something work, I cut it out. I got rid of it. So that was and understand something. I had no pretensions. I mean, I was nobody. I am nobody. But I mean, I was just going to make this for chuckles. I was just going to, I had no idea that it would sell to people. And then when I had the idea that maybe I could do a Kickstarter and get some traction, I figure, you sell a couple hundred copies and you had a fun experience and you move on. Well, it was, despite being spectacularly ugly in its first rendition, it still appealed to people. And it was spectacularly ugly because I may have a Victorian interest as far as history, but I don't have a sense of Victorian style. And I had to be dragged kicking and screaming in my first Kickstarter to sort of give a facelift to the look so that it was more in line with something of where style was so important. But that's generally the notion I had, was to make a theme first game and then try to attach it to crunchy mechanics.
So you talked about doing your homework and going back to school. If somebody wants to take a similar path, what are some starter books for them to acquire to begin digging more deeply into this history, into this background?
Well, I have a couple of books. The real work is done just on the internet. There's an amazing amount of British material on the manor houses and on that period of time. So you can go and take any particular manor house that you're interested in, and you're going to find a website dedicated to it, a society that supports its preservation, historical mirror images, historical material attached to that. For example, on the upstairs downstairs box, I found the photographer who went to what I call Alderley Hall, which is the main box image. And he photographed that for as an assignment by the historical society that was preserving that manor house. And I got permission to use his images, and the kitchen is from the kitchen inside Audley End, which is the name of the actual manor. And that's what's on the cover of Upstairs Downstairs. So I reached out to people like that. There's books like Life Below Stairs, which is True Lives of Servants, which I found. There's the Isabella Beeston book. She deals with domestics, and it's written in 1861, which is the perfect time frame. But I would say most of it was spent just going to those historical societies in Great Britain and looking at what they had preserved and studying that way. But I do have to interject here. So when I did my initial Kickstarter, set aside the graphic design issues that I had to work through, the fidelity of the Victorian content was probably very good for a layman, but it wasn't up to historical standards by a long shot. I had a lot of problems with some of the assumptions and some of the information I put in there. And I ran into, during the first Kickstarter, a gentleman named David Buckland, who happened to be an editor of those very romances that you like. He is an editor of romantic period novels and of Victorian literature being written today. And perfect British gentleman, incongruously living in Singapore. So I corresponded with him in Singapore. He was in Singapore, but he was this editor of Victorian literature, if you will. And he very politely just pointed out that I had made an error in a couple places when he saw some of my material. And I immediately just reached out and said, wow. I said, would you mind lending me a little bit of your knowledge? This gentleman critiqued everything that I put into writing. And if it were not for him, and there were a couple of other very generous Brits, Guy Allen is one of them, Martin Joines, that jumped in and offered their assistance. And well, if it wasn't for that very friendly community of gamers from across the pond, the obsession would have fallen flat, because it just would not have measured up to the historical standards. And I'll give you an example. If you take a look at the family members, I should probably grab, well, I won't do it. I'll leave that as a homework assignment. But if you look at the family members for like family Wessex, you will find that the son, the daughter, and the parents all have different last names. Something as simple as that, where the the Earl or the Viscount is taking the name of the estate, his son is taking the family name, and the daughter takes another name. And I get that all explained in detail by David Buckland in particular. That's high level stuff that I never would have been able to find. I didn't find when I did my research. No one got into that sort of depth. And you could go into the geography of Derbyshire, the different locations, the Peak District, and areas in there, so that you could add context that would be not only thematic, but it would resonate with the people who are living in that area right now. And the truest testament to the help that I got from those folks generously. And no one said, hey, send me a check. I loaded them up with games. I gave them credit, and I gave them my undying gratitude, and I would have gone further, but they just said, no, we just want this idea, which we truly love, to measure up. And the fact that there's several hundred copies in England now, and no one has ever found fault or flaw with anything that ultimately emerged as the game, is to their credit, not mine. I laid a lot of groundwork, but they actually built a lot of the theme that I would have been unable to build even with heavy research.
That is so cool. And I actually want to go back to one more part of your research. So you enlisted the help of a photographer who was photographing old manor houses. You also have photographs to represent the different gentry that you can put into your hand for the game. What inspired you to use real photographs? Where do those come from?
The hardest, let me rephrase it, the most difficult thing facing anybody who wants to design a game that they're serious about, not something that they're just dabbling in, is art. Art is exceptionally expensive, and it's exceptionally important. I've got 3 self-published novels, and just my cover art was $600 per image for those 3 books.
Ooh.
Think about that. If you've got 70 cards, just because it's a little bit smaller, that is a barrier that really stands between anybody, in particular anybody who's got a fantasy concept where you can't draw from reality at all. You can't use your Adobe or Photoshop, InDesign skills to go ahead and antique things or do whatever. You've got to basically have original artwork. So I was confronted with a problem, which was, how do I get artwork into Obsession on a shoestring budget of $0 out of my pocket? And I happened to have worked many years ago in conjunction with a company that worked with the patent office with issuing patents. And I did know that 19th century materials, in particular photographs, are public domain. So the light bulb went off, and I said to myself, I wonder what kind of quality public domain photographs of real 19th century people are out there. And the answer is a lot. There is now originally I wanted a Regency game, or I wanted a romantic period game, 1830s, 1820s.
Yeah.
And there's no camera work back then. So I switched to 1860s, which is just shortly into the photographic period after, I think you call them a daguerreotype. I can never pronounce it. But if you've ever looked at an old photo and seen this sort of sepia-toned frame around somebody looking into the camera with sort of a maniacal look, that probably fed into the Victorian macabre type of genre that's out there. But anyway, those were from like 1850, I think. And once you once you get into the 1860s and beyond, there is a whole host of folks, all of which I would capture the ones that were in the best condition, and I would retouch them and try to improve them. And the names are not the people of that time, but those are all real people. And they're all, just retouched and then put in a frame. So it turned out to be me at a loss of how to get art into the game, stumbling upon a really cool sort of historically preservative moment where I've captured, 130, 140, if you total up all the cards, people who were alive in the 19th century, and put them on cards. So it was a bit of a serendipity that happened.
Nice. And I love that you mentioned that you are also a writer. I was wondering about that because I can tell that you really enjoyed writing the little descriptions of everyone, like their little bios on the cards, and also the general story. Is that something that you intended to do from the beginning? Is it a natural part of your creative process? Do you have any favorite characters that you created among the cards?
I do. I'm going to, even though I know you didn't intend it, I'm going to read between the lines, because the nice part about having a little bit of a creative writing streak has a bad side, which is in writing rule books that are short, brief, and clear. And I know that is the albatross that I carry. And future games, I will be finding those very precise technical writers to help me out. But I was on my own, and naturally, that's why I generated 42 pages of rule books for one game, just the base game with the glossary. But yes, I do. Again, that was all theme. I felt that the flavor texts were important for theme. I enjoy a well-executed theme, and I get a little frustrated at theme that's just pasted on. I feel like that's sort of copping out, and it's not always easy, but it's, I think, possible. It's interesting how mechanics sort of organically make themselves known when you're sort of narrowly focused on theme, and so the flavor text was theme, and what became the driving force of what those flavor texts were is that I had to, in my mind, for that credibility I was describing as far as coherence, thematic coherence, link the flavor text to the favor. So I wanted all flavor text to have some connection to the favor. So for example, if you had a pounds favor, you had a money favor. A lot of people think that somebody comes to the bowling green and you have a game of bowls and money changes hands. That's not the context of a pounds favor. And I go through great pains to indicate that all the favors, they're not concurrent with the activity, and they flow from your acquaintance and the type of person that you're bringing into your social circle. So if someone has a pound favor, I link that to either political influence or more commonly travel, having an awareness of international affairs, because the way that aristocrats made their money, they had rents for the land that they owned, and then they had usually a money manager or business manager that would, do what any business manager would do, would put their money to work. It was something they typically didn't get in the weeds themselves. They dealt with it at 30,000 feet. But if the business manager wanted to invest in the tea trade, that'd be recommended, and maybe that's where the money would go. And so that pound favor would be linked to the flavor text, because that person spent, several years in Delhi and has returned back to Derbyshire, which is where he grew up. And you had him over in the drawing room, and what did you discuss? Well, what was it like in Delhi? And that might lead to some things that would lead to investments. Or if you had, for example, a reputation favor, it would be somebody who had the reputation chops to actually reflect well on your house. If you have, you know, one of my favorite guys, you ask who my favorite guys are, Albert Plantagenet is one. He's a great pitcher. He's a distant relative of the Plantagenets, and in the flavor text it says that he won't hesitate to tell you that. And he brings reputation. So remember, you're sort of scratching and clawing your way up from a really rough stretch where the manor house that you live in has fallen into disrepair. The most common thing they had to do was they had to shut off a portion of the manor house, because to keep candles lit, to keep fires burning, to keep domestic staff, to keep it clean, it was too overwhelming if you were impoverished. And so you basically would shrink your livable space in your manor house. So the notion of a Plantagenet coming and visiting your new drawing room that you just opened up after it's been boarded up for 27 years because you can't afford to keep that space warm and clean, and a Plantagenet comes and sits there for an afternoon, that's meaningful in that sort of rural area of aristocratic London, right? Or aristocratic Britain, right? And so that brings reputation. That spreads by word of mouth, usually through the domestics, but also through the gentry themselves. And that's why there is a reputation favor linked to certain people. Might be somebody who has a certain rank. If you have a marquess come to your house and you're scratching your way up to get back into relevance in Derbyshire society, then that means a lot. And the same thing would be for invitations. Those would be the gadflies, the social butterflies, and it usually references that. So all the flavor text is intended to link to the favor in order to convey that. And on the back page of the Obsession Rulebook, I break down how I try to do that, because I think that makes it more than just something I made up out of my head, which I didn't make up out of my head, but at least it's connected to the favor.
Fair enough. So I want to talk about who gets flavor text and who gets an image in this game. So, you are playing, a house that's kind of down their luck, trying to rebuild, but you're essentially an aristocratic person. And the people who are in your hand who get funny flavor text are also people who are either aristocratic or rich, the American heiress, for example. But your workers, the game is really driven by the service staff. And, I guess I was wondering, do you wish that you had personalized them more? What led to the decision to kind of break between fancy people and not in that particular way?
The first design prototypes had both. Mm-hmm. And it was a card on card type of mechanic. It was actually a small tile on card, but there was an image and there was a very small amount of flavor text. It was cumbersome. And I have a certain affection for the meeple part of a Euro game, and I wanted to sort of capture the flavor there. I think I take gratification from, let's face it, you and I probably both would say if we had to pick a group of people in Downton Abbey that we liked, either the servants or the Granthams, we'd pick the servants. That's where our hearts and our sympathies, at least mine, were attached to. So I'm very much, as everybody who's listened to my videos knows, service is my favorite part of the game. And I think I take satisfaction from the fact that you mismanage service in this game, you will get smoked. Managing the service, building a service engine, while it's impersonal, it at least acknowledges the fact that without service, your estate is staying in the doldrums. And yeah, I guess I could have done that. It had it had a clunky feel to me, going card on card, and I wanted sort of a tactile component too in the way of meeples. And I think once you go to a meeple, you lose a little bit of the ability to personalize a meeple. So I tried to do it with the shape and with how they were essential.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, ain't nothing getting done in this game without the correct staff.
Yep. And you will find, if you say, I'm gonna make a run without a second footman for this game, you'll lose. I have personally never done that and done well. Maybe I've got one win, but I've played thousands of these games, and most people haven't played that many. I mean, there's just got to be a real ear for what you need, what your gentry deck looks like, and getting that service mix just right.
So Obsession is a bit of an obsession for you. This is still your first published game, and you're entering the third printing. Is that correct?
I am. Just started last month. Fortunately, the geopolitical environment and the last fun year and a half we've had has made everything from manufacturing to transoceanic shipping a nightmare. So everything's a lot slower than I would have liked. But yeah, I did sell. So I had my first printing was 1,850 copies of the base game. And then I renovated the game from what I learned. That was my first effort, and added the upstairs, downstairs expansion. And 2 years after the first Kickstarter, I did the second Kickstarter, and I printed 5,000 of the base game and the expansions. And I'm doing another 5,000 in this printing.
Wow. And so are you ever planning to make another game? And if you do, is it going to be on this theme?
I am. I do. And in fact, over Memorial Day, I spent playing a prototype over at the barbecue I was at of a game. And I do have different titles with different genres. I have a space game that's in development. The biggest hurdle is, and we talked off mic about what I do for a living. So what I do for a living during the day is I involved with artificial hearts and artificial lungs. And so I'm in hospitals most days, and it's pretty demanding, but I'm retiring from that in less than a year. And then once I do that, then I will have the freedom to branch out and tackle some of the bigger projects. I got a smaller project I hope to kickstart maybe by the end of the year. We'll see. A card game, a trick-taking game. But as far as a bigger title, it's gonna require a little bit of dedicated effort, because I started in 2015 with Obsession. 2014, I started with my first prototype, and it kickstarted in 2017. And I can't spend 3 years in a title, but when I'm doing it part-time, I didn't have much choice.
Right.
So when I retire, I'll be able to dedicate. I won't really retire. I'll just go to a new career of Kayenta Games, and I'll be able to dedicate my energies. And having made every possible mistake I can make in game development and crowdfunding, I will do it more efficiently the next time around when I develop a new title. But it's been all good. I mean, but boy, do I owe a debt of gratitude to our people in our hobby who were very supportive of the project.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that makes Obsession, I think, unique among games. So not only is it thematically different, but it is very rare, and I think that's actually a bad thing in some ways, to see someone really come back to the same game and make improvements, make changes, make the game better, and then reprint it. So how did you learn how to take all that feedback, and then what did you learn from that process?
Well, you got to swallow your pride. You know, initially, I think the fact that I fully recognized that my first Kickstarter was a bit of a humble project. My goal was just to get it funded at $36,000, which was my funding level. And so I wasn't overly optimistic about it being a significant game. It was just a project I wanted to do.
Mhm.
But when I got the first criticism, and I mean, some of the criticism is, when you're dealing in the online world, can might not be too tender. It can be pretty rough. And I remember, stewing for a day, and then I said, "What are you, an idiot? What they're saying happens to be right." You have people who, despite their concerns about the project, are engaging you. Well, listen to them. And I had some harsh critics who came out and said, "This is wrong, this is wrong, this looks incorrect, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong." And I reached out to them and I said, "Would you help me make it better?" And they flipped 180 degrees and graciously gave me every minute of time that I could ask for. So it's an amazing resource. And I don't know the designer world at all. I don't know any other game designers. So I don't know how they do it. I'm sure they have teams and they don't do it part-time in their home office, but the resource that are the people who play the games is really pretty spectacular. And I mean, at an expert level. I pointed out David Buckland, who was a Victorian editor who gravitated to the project. There's that kind of expertise in every area. I mean, I have an idea for a game about Iceland. I went to Iceland with my daughter, and if I needed some expertise in the area of Iceland, I've already found somebody. There were two people from Iceland that kickstarted my first game, and I had a conversation with them. And we're happy to help you. So it was a great resource, and it's a little tough because if you ask opinions of 100 people, you're not going to get a consensus. So you're going to disappoint some people if you use your judgment to go in one direction and not another, which you're going to have to do, or you're going to have AP. So it's a little bit of a delicate path to sort of navigate. But I think if you're just very honest out of the gate that, that's a reality, and I'm not going to do that for this reason, but I'm going to do that. Thank you. That's fantastic. And what it taught me is that I did play testing in a very insular group with the first edition of Obsession, the first design. And it taught me the value of doing play testing in an enormous group before you approach a Kickstarter. I didn't know any different. That might be blocking and tackling 101 for game designers I'm sure Vital Lacerda play tested on Mars with 500 people. I didn't have that luxury or that knowledge. But now I do. And boy, the great thing is that now that I have a great relationship with Panda Games, they'll make my prototypes in order to make the playtest experience attractive. You don't want to send things that looks like you did arts and crafts in your office and have people judging an incomplete copy. So I'll be able to do very nice prototypes and be able to play test things more robustly than I did. That's the reason there's differences between the first edition and second edition, is my true playtesting fell in between those two publication dates. There's hardly any changes between the second and third, almost none. I corrected a couple grammatical errors and one or two component errors, and then clarified some of my voluminous rules. But that's it. The game plays identical.
Interesting. And so just a softy question here at the end. What are you playing now that you and your family are really enjoying?
I just played Era Medieval Age, and we're on a little strong play of that. I don't know if you know what it's like a pegboard where you build a medieval castle, a dice drafting game. Very clever. I just got my Terraforming Mars big box. My Lord, is that a giant box. I love Terraforming Mars. And my son, who is an engineer, had 3D printed a lot of the stuff that they've now put in there. They've done it much nicer. So we've got that up and going. And I'm looking behind me at what been playing a little London, which is a nice card game that's right in the era that we're talking about. Can I ask a favor?
Yeah.
I wanna mention one thing that I think would be important to put out there as it relates to the design of Obsession, because there is a mentality amongst a large group of gamers that randomness is bad. It's understandable. No one wants to work at something and have a dice roll wipe out all their very good tactical planning. But it really is something that has gone too far, because randomness introduces into games raw materials for stories. And the reason that, I've had some people be very critical of blind card draws and Obsession, or they've been very critical of the difficulty of certain objectives, things of that nature. And I'm fine. I learned from that first Kickstarter experience, there's a big group out there. Not everybody's going to be happy with your design, and that's fine. But the randomness is in Obsession because there has to be a mechanical way, in my opinion, to capture Victorian fate. If you think about the British literature that we love, it is all about stunning revelations, things that come out of left field. You have, like I said, a wife in the attic. You have Wickham is who he is, or all these revelations. Because of that sense of propriety, it makes for a great backdrop for shock and for what people are going to do about it. So that blind card draw is a story. When you get the American Heiress, a story comes into your hand, right? You look at the American Heiress, you make a joke about the American Heiress. You got an American, that's a story. When you pull a CAD, or you asked about another favorite card of mine from upstairs, downstairs, the curmudgeon. You pull the curmudgeon or whatever, you're getting stories. I designed the game not for people to win. There's an endless number of games that people can go apply their Bobby Fischer chess skills and grind out a victory through their mental superiority. And I tell you what, they'd smoke me in a heartbeat. But that's not what Obsession is about. And I couldn't, you've got Vital Lucerda, you've got Pfister, you've got people that can give you that. What I'm trying to do with the Trojan horse is two things. Is the outside of the horse has got that theme, and the inside of the horse is a crunchy euro that the best player can't necessarily win. Because the number one objection I've had in recruiting and evangelizing board gamers to the table in my family, extended family, and friends, I don't want to play you. You've memorized rules for the 75 games sitting in your office. Why do I want to be your punching bag? I'm going to sit down and I'm going to be trying to figure out how to move my pawn, and you're going to already have found the pathway to victory. I don't want to be your punching bag. And so Obsession is intended to be a story with an unpredictable outcome. And I have just as much fun losing Obsession as I have winning Obsession. And it doesn't mean we don't try to win. That's the magic of it. You try to overcome the fact that you have 7 guys in your Gentry deck in the first 2 seasons. And what am I going to do about that? First of all, you got a funny story. you got a weird Rolodex, but now you got to figure out what to do with it. Okay, maybe I'm going to get after the cricket field and the smoking room, and I'm going to hire that extra valet, and something comes out of that. So I fully understand that 90% of gamers are going to probably be turned off by a Victorian theme. All good. I dislike Gloomhaven intensely. We all have our preferences about great designs or any design. But the nature of this, I have no sympathy if your goal is you're frustrated that you can't win, because that's not the design. The design is not for the best tactical or strategic player to win. The goal of that is evangelism. It's board game evangelism. And I get emails I don't want to say every day, but 3, 4, 5 a week that testify to that. X person who never played board games now loves this game and wants to play it. And she beats me every time, or he beats me every time. And it's great because we're playing games together. So that's just a bit of clarification. You can edit that or chop it out as you see fit. But I don't pretend to be, like I said, a Vital Lacerda. There's people who can make your crunchy games that you hunger for. This is about a theme and an uncertain outcome, and that's the design intent.
Now, you know what? I'm going to leave it right there. And speaking of getting a lot of emails, what is the best way to contact you?
Email. My Lord. You've got Instagram, you've got Facebook, you've got Kickstarter email, you've got Twitter. It's so difficult when all these messages come from all these sources. If you email me at Hallagan@KayentaPublishing.com, that's a long stretch there. Maybe you can put it in the notes.
I will.
That would be the best. That's the best way to get a hold of me. For anyone who's asking, I expect late August, early September that the games will arrive in Europe and the continental U.S. And that's when we should be back in business as it relates to new copies of Obsession.
Excellent. And I, of course, can be reached anywhere as Beyond Solitaire. Dan, thank you so much for coming on. It's just been so fun to talk to you about a game that I really enjoy.
Wonderful to be on. I appreciate it. And I'm glad you enjoy the game.
Thanks, everybody. Leave a comment. And most of all, happy gaming.